So I want you to imagine it's the early 1930s, and there's this Russian psychologist, right? Alexander Luria.
Right, the Luria expedition.
Exactly. So he travels all the way from Moscow, which is this booming, industrializing city, deep into these super remote agrarian villages in Uzbekistan.
A completely off the grid.
Totally. And he sits down in this dusty courtyard with a local farmer. And this is a guy whose entire life is just dictated by, the seasons, the crops, direct survival.
Let's create reality.
Yeah. So Luria looks at the guy and gives him this really simple logic puzzle. He says, in the far north, where there is snow, all bears are white. Novaya Zemlya is in the far north, and there's always snow there. What color are the bears there?
Which to us is just a classic syllogism. I mean, you establish a premise, apply it to a location, boom, you deduce the outcome.
Right. A modern mind answers that in like half a second.
White bears. Obviously.
Obviously. But the farmer, he doesn't say white. He just looks at Luria, like totally bewildered, and says, I have never been there. How could I know?
So fascinating.
And Luria pushes him. He repeats the rules.
Yeah.
But the farmer just flat out refuses to answer.
Yeah.
He says, you can only answer that if you have seen them with your own eyes.
Wow.
And that single bizarre conversation, which sounds like just some quirky historical footnote, it actually holds the absolute secret to why you, listening to us right now, might feel completely overwhelmed by your career or your education or just the modern world in general.
Yeah, because the thing about that farmer is he wasn't unintelligent. Not at all. He was probably brilliant at surviving in his specific environment.
Right.
But his thinking was entirely tethered to his direct concrete experience. He just lacked the conceptual scaffolding to transfer a logical rule to a domain he hadn't personally experienced. He literally couldn't step outside of what he already knew.
And stepping outside of what we know is exactly the mission for today. So welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are plunging straight into the core arguments of this phenomenal book by David Epstein. It's called Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World.
It's such a game changer of a book.
It really is.
Yeah.
So if you are someone who, constantly juggles multiple interests, or if you love trying new things, dabbling in different jobs, and you sometimes lie awake at night panicking that you're falling behind all those laser-focused people out there.
The people who knew what they wanted to do at age 10.
Yes. If that's you, this deep dive is going to be a massive, massive validation of your life choices.
It fundamentally rewrites how you view learning and success because, let's be honest, society has sold us a very specific, a very narrow recipe for greatness.
Right, so let's unpack that recipe right away.
Yeah.
Because the cultural narrative is totally dominated by this one specific archetype. We basically want our lives, and especially our kids' lives, to look like a GPS route.
Yep. Plug in the destination at age 5, calculate the blue line, and just drive.
Put your head down and don't deviate.
Yeah.
And the patron saint of this GPS route is Tiger Woods.
Oh, absolutely. The quintessential Head Start story. I mean, the story is borderline mythological at this point.
It really is. So his dad, Earl Woods, who was a former Green Beret, by the way, gave Tiger a putter when he was 7 months old. 7 months.
He's literally in a high chair.
Sitting in a high chair in the garage, just watching his dad hit balls. And then at 10 months, he climbs down and perfectly imitates the swing. By age 2, he's on national television driving a golf ball past Bob Hope.
Which is insane to think about.
Totally insane. And by 8, he's beating his own father. Earl didn't just want a good golfer. He systematically engineered a prodigy. It is the literal embodiment of highly specialized deliberate practice, like the 10,000-hour rule applied from the crib.
And it's a deeply seductive narrative, right? We take that Tiger Woods story and we extrapolate it to create what researchers actually call the cult of the head start.
The cult of the head start.
Yeah, we start assuming that early narrow specialization is just like, it's a universal law of gravity for success. We tell ourselves, if you want to be the best in the world, you have to start on day 1, and you can never, ever deviate.
Which brings up Laszlo Polgar, because he took this idea to a terrifying extreme.
Oh, the Chess sisters. Yes.
Right. So Polgar was this Hungarian educational psychologist, and he literally read biographies of geniuses, decided traditional education was garbage, and was like, I can turn any healthy kid into a prodigy. He even published a book called Bring Up Genius.
Kind of an arrogant title, honest.
Very.
Yeah.
He basically said, give me a kid, I'll make them a genius. So he and his wife intentionally bred their 3 daughters, Susan, Sophia, and Judith, to be chess grandmasters.
And the mechanism there is what's crazy, because it wasn't just casual play on the weekends. Their entire house was a shrine to chess.
Oh, yeah.
Thousands of chess books, the walls are covered in tournament records, the girls are playing blindfolded. I mean, they were specialized to a molecular level from infancy.
And the wild part is, it worked. Susan became the first woman to earn the Grandmaster title through standard tournament play.
Yeah.
And Judith is pretty much universally considered the greatest female chess player ever.
Right.
So you look at Tiger, you look at the Polgars, and it creates this pop culture feedback loop. We all start believing that to be elite at anything, coding, playing the cello, running a startup, you've got to start when you're a toddler.
But, and here's the critical pivot in all the data, when sports scientists actually look at the developmental paths of eventual elite athletes across all sports, the Tiger path is not the rule.
It's the exception.
It is a massive statistical anomaly. The data overwhelmingly points to a completely different model, which is the Roger Federer path.
Yes. The Roger path, this is where it gets so good, because Roger's childhood was the exact polar opposite of Tiger's.
Completely.
As a kid in Switzerland, Roger he dabbled. He played squash, he skied, he wrestled, swam, skateboarded, basketball, handball. If a sport involved a ball or just like physical coordination, he was doing it.
And his parents had a totally different vibe, too. The research describes them as pulley rather than pushy. Yeah, like they weren't orchestrating this intense ascent to global dominance. Actually, they constantly urged him to stop taking tennis so seriously. They just wanted him to be a kid.
There's that hilarious anecdote from when he was a teenager. A local Swiss paper interviews him, and they ask, what are you going to buy with your first real tennis paycheck?
Mm-hmm.
And the reporter writes down that Roger said, a Mercedes.
Oh, no!
Right? So his mom reads this and is just horrified. She thinks he's turned into this arrogant, greedy prodigy. But they go back and listen to the tape, and they realize he was speaking thick Swiss German. He didn't say a Mercedes. He said Mercedes.
You just wanted more music CDs.
Exactly. He was just a totally normal, meandering teenager. He didn't even start focusing solely on tennis until his late teens, way after all his peers were already, working with specialized coaches and sports psychologists.
And yet he becomes arguably the most versatile, dominant tennis player in history. And when researchers actually crunch the numbers on eventual elites, this is the dominant pattern.
The dabbling.
Yeah. Eventual elites typically go through this massive sampling period. They play a ton of lightly structured sports, they build broad physical proficiencies, they figure out their own interests, their biological limits, their natural abilities, and only much later do they actually focus in and ramp up the technical, deliberate practice.
It's literally everywhere in the data once you look. Like the German national soccer team that won the 2014 World Cup, a study showed those elite players actually played less organized, deliberate soccer than amateur league players did until they were like 22.
Wow.
They just spent their youth playing unstructured games, messing around, trying different positions. Or Vasyl Lomachenko, one of the greatest pound-for-pound boxers alive. He literally took 4 years off from boxing as a kid because his dad made him go learn traditional Ukrainian dance.
And he credits the dancing for his footwork. Right.
Exactly. His footwork in the ring is untouchable. But we connect this to the bigger picture. The cult of the head start hasn't just ruined youth sports. It's infected education, the corporate world, everything.
Especially the tech industry. I mean, it's violent in tech.
Mm-hmm.
Mark Zuckerberg famously stood up at Stanford and just said, young people are just smarter. It codified this whole myth of the 20-year-old hyper-specialized startup billionaire who's been writing code in diapers.
Okay, but let me push back on you here, because I struggle with this. If I'm an employer, or say I'm a VC investor, and I'm hiring a lead software engineer, I kind of do want the 22-year-old who has coded for 10,000 hours.
Sure, it feels safer.
Right. I want the person who breathes Python and C++ pay. I don't really want the 45-year-old who spent his 20s, playing the mandolin, running a failed food truck, and doing interpretive dance.
Yeah.
How can you argue that the Roger Federer dabbler is statistically better for a highly technical role than the Tiger Woods specialist?
It is a phenomenal question. And it's exactly why the cult of the head start is so hard to kill, because your intuition feels logically flawless. But the data tells a completely different story.
Okay, lay it on me.
If you look at research from the U.S. Census Bureau and MIT, they analyzed the fastest growing, most successful tech startups in the country. The average age of the founder at the time of founding wasn't 22.
What was it?
It was 45.
45.
45. And the reason for this brings us to the absolute core mechanism of why the dabbler wins. It comes down to the specific type of environment those Head Start stories happen in. Tiger Woods and the Polgar sisters grew up operating in what psychologists call kind learning environments.
Kind environments. Okay,
Yeah.
we need to define these terms thoroughly because learning this completely shifted how I view my own mistakes.
Yeah.
What exactly makes an environment kind?
So psychologist Robin Hogarth coined these terms to describe how environments dictate human learning. A kind learning environment is a domain where the rules are perfectly clear, the boundaries are strict, the patterns repeat exactly, and most importantly, the feedback is immediate and 100% accurate.
So golf.
Golf is incredibly kind. You hit the ball, you immediately see exactly where it goes. It lands in the fairway or it lands in the bunker. You adjust your grip, you swing again. The wind might shift, but the fundamental physics and rules of the game, they never change.
Right.
Chess is another perfect example. The board never changes size. The knight always moves in an L shape. In kind environments, if you just engage in repetitive, deliberate practice, you're absolutely guaranteed to improve.
But the real world is almost never a golf course.
Precisely. The real world is what Hogarth calls a wicked learning environment.
Wicked. I love that term.
It's so accurate. In a wicked domain, the rules are often unclear or they're just entirely incomplete. Patterns might not exist at all, or they're deeply hidden beneath a ton of noise. And the most dangerous part, the feedback you get is delayed, inaccurate, or completely misleading.
Okay, give me an example of a wicked environment.
Think about a hospital emergency room or the stock market, predicting geopolitical events, managing a startup.
Oh, there is this historical anecdote from the source material that illustrates a wicked environment so viscerally.
The typhoid doctor.
Yes, the typhoid doctor.
Mm.
So there was this renowned physician in New York City in the early 20th century. And he was famous for his ability to diagnose typhoid fever. But his method was just wild. He would diagnose it simply by feeling the patient's tongues with his bare hands.
Which is horrifying.
Horrifying.
Yeah.
But over and over, he would diagnose typhoid before the patient showed a single serious symptom. And over, his diagnoses turned out to be correct. The patients would invariably develop the disease. So he thought his vast experience was making him this master diagnostician.
Right, but the feedback loop was completely corrupted.
Exactly. What was actually happening was that he was acting as a massive vector. He was literally infecting the patients with typhoid from his own unwashed hands. His repetitive success reinforced the exact wrong lesson. He thought he was learning, but his experience was actually making him lethal.
That is the ultimate terror of a wicked learning environment. Experience can actually reinforce terrible habits because you aren't seeing the true consequences of your actions. Or the feedback is pointing you to the totally wrong variable.
Which is so scary.
It is, and this gets to the heart of a really famous debate between two legendary figures in psychology, Gary Klein and Daniel Kahneman.
Daniel Kahneman, the behavioral economist who won a Nobel Prize for proving how irrational human decision-making is.
That's the one. So Kahneman spent his career studying human behavior predictions. For example, he studied psychologists who were evaluating military recruits to predict who would become good commanding officers.
Okay.
Kahneman found that the evaluators' experience bred massive confidence, but absolutely zero actual predictive skill. Their models were completely flawed, but because they never got immediate, accurate feedback on those specific recruits years later, they just assumed they were great at their jobs.
But Gary Klein saw the exact opposite, right?
Right. Klein is a pioneer of naturalistic decision-making. He studied people like firefighters, intensive care nurses, chess masters, and he found that their intuition was borderline miraculous. A fire commander could look at a burning building and suddenly yell, "Get out!" right before the floor collapsed, without even knowing consciously why he gave the order.
Just totally subconscious pattern recognition.
Exactly. His brain had recognized a pattern in the smoke and heat based on thousands of past fires. So Klein argued that experience builds expert intuition. Kahneman argued that experience builds dangerous overconfidence.
So who was right?
Well, they eventually collaborated on a paper to figure out why they disagreed so fiercely. And they realized they were both right, but they were studying completely different domains. Klein was studying kind domains, or at least domains with immediate, accurate feedback like a building collapsing. Kahneman was studying wicked domains like predicting complex human behavior years in the future. They concluded that experience only leads to reliable expertise in kind domains. In wicked domains, repetitive experience without broad conceptual thinking can actually make you worse.
Which brings us right back to my pushback about hiring the young coder.
Yes, let's look at that.
Because the ultimate kind domain machine is artificial intelligence. AI is the ultimate Tiger Woods. There's this concept called Moravec's paradox. It basically says that high-level reasoning requires very little computation for humans, but low-level sensory-motor skills require enormous computation for machines.
Right.
But it also applies to rules-based logic.
Mm-hmm.
In 1997, IBM's supercomputer Deep Blue famously beat Garry Kasparov, who was the reigning world chess champion. And for a lot of people, that was it. That was the death knell of human intellectual supremacy.
But the nuance there, the why behind that victory is so vital. Deep Blue won because chess, at its core, is 99% tactics.
Define tactics in this context.
Tactics are short-term calculations to gain an immediate advantage. Computers are flawless at tactics because they can calculate millions of moves per second in a closed, kind system. But bigger picture planning strategy is much, much harder to code.
And what Kasparov did next is brilliant. He didn't just give up and say the machines won. He helped organize freestyle chess tournaments.
I love freestyle chess.
It's so cool. In freestyle chess, you could enter as a human, you could enter as a supercomputer, or you could enter as a human-computer team, which they called centaurs. And what happened? The centaurs absolutely crushed both the best supercomputers operating alone and the best human grandmasters operating alone.
Because it perfectly illustrates the division of labor in the modern world. The human manages the broad open-world strategy, while the machine handles the narrow, intensive tactics.
The story of Anson Williams proves this so well. He was a British engineer, and he wasn't even a ranked chess grandmaster. He was just a decent club player. But what he was really good at was playing the video game Command & Conquer.
Which is all strategy and resource management.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He understood how to synthesize massive amounts of information from multiple computer programs, monitor different tactical engines, and guide the overarching strategy. And because of that broad integration skill, his Centaur team won the Freestyle Chess Championship against people with vastly more specialized chess experience.
So going back to your coder example, if a task involves recognizing repetitive patterns in a closed system, a machine will eventually replace you. That specialized coder you wanted to hire. If all they know is the strict syntax of a specific coding language, an AI will outcode them within a few years.
Right.
But if the task requires broad integration, adapting to changing rules, understanding human psychology to know what product to actually code, and high-level strategy, human range is unmatched.
I use this metaphor all the time now.
Yeah.
Trading exclusively for a kind environment is like trying to build an immune system by keeping a child in a hermetically sealed plastic bubble.
Oh, that's a good one.
Inside the bubble, they look perfectly healthy. They master their clean environment. But the moment you drop them into the real messy world and they face a novel virus, their system completely collapses. They have no defensive range. So if the world isn't a neat, orderly golf course, what is it?
Robin Hogarth describes much of the real world as playing Martian tennis.
Martian tennis.
Yeah, you can see the players on a court. They have rackets, they have balls, but nobody has shared the rules with you. It is entirely up to you to deduce them through observation and trial. And worse, the rules change without notice. The net might suddenly get higher. The ball might catch fire.
Which sounds exhausting.
It is. And it raises a massive evolutionary question. How did human brains adapt to handle this wicked Martian tennis modern world?
That brings us to James Flynn and the Flynn effect, which is wild. So James Flynn was a researcher who was digging through intelligence data, and he noticed something completely baffling. Generation over generation, throughout the entire 20th century, IQ scores were rising massively all over the globe.
Huge jumps.
The increases were so large that if you scored an average person from today against the norms of a century ago, today's average person would be considered a genius.
But the key is where those scores were rising. They weren't rising on tests of general knowledge or vocabulary or basic arithmetic.
Right. They were skyrocketing specifically on tests of abstract conceptual logic. Yeah. Things like Raven's progressive matrices.
Right, the visual puzzles.
Yeah, for anyone who hasn't seen it, Raven's matrices is a test with zero language. It's just visual puzzles. You see a grid of shapes that change in a specific pattern. Maybe they rotate or change color or merge, and you have to identify the missing piece. You cannot study for it. You have to deduce the invisible rule on the spot.
So Flynn realized that humans weren't necessarily getting genetically smarter in terms of raw brain power. Rather, the modern world was forcing us to put on what he called scientific spectacles.
Scientific spectacles.
Yeah. As society became more industrialized, more interconnected, more technologically complex, our daily survival required us to categorize things conceptually rather than just functionally.
Which brings us right back to Alexander Luria and the farmers in Uzbekistan.
Exactly.
When Luria showed pre-modern villagers drawings of geometric shapes, their functional brains couldn't process the abstraction.
Right. Luria would show them a solid square and a dotted square. To a modern mind wearing scientific spectacles, we immediately understand the abstract concept of squareness. We group them together.
Of course.
But when he showed them to a 26-year-old villager named Alieva, she vehemently refused to group them together. She pointed at the solid square and said it was a map. She pointed at the dotted square and said it was a watch.
Wow.
Her brain was tethered to the functional objects of her daily life. She couldn't abstract the shape from the object.
And the modern world is relentlessly abstract. We have to transfer knowledge between domains constantly. We have to take a concept we learned in an interpersonal psychology class and apply it to a tense email we're writing to a client. We have to take a historical lesson about supply chain failures in the Roman Empire and apply it to a microchip shortage in Taiwan.
It's all conceptual transfer.
But the ultimate tragedy here is that while the world demands this broad conceptual transfer, our higher education systems are practically engineered to fight against it.
Oh, the push for hyperspecialization in universities is actually damaging our ability to think. James Flynn, the same researcher, conducted an incredible study on this. He wanted to see how well university students could think outside their specific majors.
This study is terrifying if you are currently paying university tuition.
Truly. So he tested the grade point averages of seniors at a top state university against a test of broad critical thinking and conceptual reasoning.
And what did he find?
The correlation between a student having a high GPA in their major and their ability to think critically across domains was exactly zero.
Zero.
Zero. The biology majors couldn't apply basic scientific reasoning to problems outside of biology. The chemistry majors were brilliant at chemical equations, but they struggled massively to use logic when presented with a social science problem.
That is wild.
They were being heavily trained in the narrow, specific facts of their silos, but they weren't being taught the underlying mechanisms of how to think. They were being trained for kind environments like memorizing textbook answers for a multiple choice test in a profoundly wicked world.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me and super actionable for the listener.
Yep.
To build this cross-domain thinking, you have to practice solving problems where you don't have all the facts.
Yeah.
There's this concept called Fermi problems.
Oh, I love Fermi problems.
They're so good. Enrico Fermi was the brilliant physicist who created the first nuclear reactor, and he loved these back-of-the-envelope estimation puzzles. He would force his students to solve them just to break them out of their rigid, formulaic thinking. The classic example is, how many piano tuners are there in New York City?
It's a brilliant exercise because initially it feels completely impossible.
Right. If someone asks you that, your first instinct is, I don't know, let me Google it. You try to look up the exact fact.
Yeah.
But a Fermi problem demands that you answer it by breaking the problem down conceptually into structural pieces.
You have to build a logic tree.
Exactly. So you start with what you do know. What's the population of New York City? Let's say roughly 8 million. Okay, how many households is that? Maybe an average of 2 to 3 people per household. So let's call it 3 million households. What percentage of households might own a piano? Maybe 1 in 30. So that's 100,000 pianos.
Okay, following the math.
How often do they get tuned? Once a year. How many pianos can one tuner tune in a single working day? Maybe 4. So if a tuner works 250 days a year, they tune 1,000 pianos a year. If there are 100,000 pianos, you need 100 piano tuners.
And even if your individual estimates are slightly off, maybe there are 150 tuners or 80, the conceptual framework gets you to a highly accurate order of magnitude. You didn't say 10 and you didn't say 1,000,000.
Exactly. Learning how to think through a Fermi problem is infinitely more valuable to you than memorizing the exact physiological structure of an Arctic plant for a biology exam. Because the Fermi method, breaking down an abstract unknown problem into manageable components, transfers to any industry.
Right. If you're a consultant sizing a market or a logistics manager estimating shipping delays, it's the same mental scaffolding.
But this creates a massive paradox. If the modern world requires this broad, flexible thinking, why does our learning process feel so rigid? Why are we practically engineered to learn the wrong way?
Because it turns out the way the human brain builds this flexible, cross-domain knowledge requires us to abandon everything that makes learning feel fast, efficient, and productive.
This is a mind-bending shift. Let's look at a historical example of how to build flexible knowledge. We're going back in time to Venice in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Fighi del Coro.
The orphans.
Yeah. These were orphan girls, many of them abandoned as infants, who were raised in charitable institutions called ospedali. They were literally hidden away behind iron grates, but they became the absolute rock stars of Europe.
They essentially drove the Baroque music revolution. Composers like Antonio Vivaldi were employed by these institutions, writing hundreds of complex concertos specifically for these orphan girls to perform.
Yes. But what is wild is how they trained. Because if you think about classical music today, it's very Tiger Woods. Pick up a violin at age 4, do 10,000 hours on the violin, never touch another instrument.
Right.
But the Figli were entirely different. They learned to sing first. Then they learned to play an instrument. And then they learned to play practically every other instrument the institution owned. There was this woman named Anna Maria who started on the violin, then moved to the harpsichord, the cello, the lute, the mandolin, the oboe. She was a virtuoso on all of them. They constantly switched instruments and cross-trained.
From a modern efficiency-obsessed perspective, that seems like a massive waste of time. Why not just focus on one instrument and perfect the technique? But cognitive psychology explains exactly why this works. The neuroscience behind it is based on a concept coined by psychologist Robert Bjork called desirable difficulties.
Okay, wait, what exactly is a desirable difficulty?
Yeah.
Because usually when I'm studying for a massive presentation, I feel like I'm struggling and forgetting things. I feel like I'm failing.
That is what Bjork calls the illusion of fluency. When learning feels easy and seamless-like, when you're just rereading your highlighted notes, your brain isn't actually doing the hard work of building new neural pathways. It just recognizes the words. Desirable difficulties mean that true, durable learning only happens when we are struggling to retrieve information.
It's the cognitive vaccine metaphor again. You have to inject a little bit of chaos, a little bit of difficulty into the brain so it knows how to fight and reconstruct the memory when the real test comes.
Exactly. And Bjork highlights a few specific mechanisms for this. The first is the generation effect. This means that struggling to generate an answer on your own, even if you get it completely wrong, actively primes the brain for subsequent learning.
Like trying to guess the answer before looking at the flashcard.
Yes. When you stretch your neural pathways trying to find an answer, you're physically altering your brain chemistry to make the correct answer stick better when it is finally revealed.
This connects to the hypercorrection effect. If you guess an answer and you are incredibly confident that you're right, but you turn out to be totally wrong, the shock of being wrong creates a powerful memory trace. When you finally learn the correct answer, it sticks like glue.
Exactly. Now, the other two critical difficulties are spacing and interleaving. Spacing is intentionally leaving significant time between practice sessions. You actually want to allow your brain to forget a little bit of the information.
Which feels so counterproductive.
It does, but why? Because when you sit down again, your brain has to work twice as hard to reconstruct the memory. That intense struggle to retrieve the memory physically thickens the myelin sheath around the neural pathway, making it faster and stronger for the future.
And interleaving is what the Venetian orphans did.
Right. Interleaving is mixing up different types of problems or skills rather than practicing the same thing over and over in a block. Instead of practicing only forehands and tennis for an hour, you mix forehands, backhands, and volleys randomly. The brain doesn't just learn how to execute the shot, it learns how to identify which shot is required based on the context.
But the tragedy is that our education system punishes desirable difficulties because they look messy. There is this perfect example in the research of an 8th grade math classroom.
Oh, this study is heartbreaking.
It is. The researchers observe a teacher who is incredibly charismatic, deeply caring, universally loved by her students. She's teaching algebraic expressions. But every time the students struggle with a complex, open-ended conceptual problem, she immediately swoops in and gives them a hint. She breaks it down. She practically turns the abstract problem into a multiple-choice question.
She smooths the road for them.
Right. So the kids eventually guess the right answer. They high-five. They feel brilliant. The teacher feels effective. Yeah. But they aren't actually learning the mathematical concept. They're just learning how to read her social cues and follow the breadcrumbs of her hints.
This phenomenon was starkly demonstrated in an animal experiment with a monkey named Macduff. Researchers trained monkeys to memorize complex lists. When the monkeys were given constant automatic hints during the training phase, their immediate performance was spectacular. They looked like prodigies.
Yeah.
But on test day, when the hints were removed, Macduff scored a 0. It was a complete knowledge mirage. The learning was tethered entirely to the hint, not the concept.
And this isn't just monkeys. It happens at the highest levels of human education. Look at the incredible study from the United States Air Force Academy. Researchers analyzed 100 calculus professors over several years. They looked at the student evaluations of the professors and the students' performance on the immediate end of semester exam.
The results here are profoundly counterintuitive.
They really are. The professors who got the absolute best student evaluations and whose students performed the highest on the immediate exam turned out to be the worst teachers for long-term learning.
The absolute worst.
When those exact students moved on to advanced calculus the second and physics courses the next year, they bombed. They failed miserably. Why? Because their initial professors made the learning too easy. They taught to the test. They provided clear algorithmic steps without demanding deep conceptual struggle.
On the flip side, the professors who got the lowest student evaluations, whose classes were frustrating and messy, produced students who absolutely crushed the advanced courses. Those strict professors forced their students into desirable difficulties. They made them struggle conceptually.
It's just such a profound disconnect between our intuition and reality. When you are learning a new skill for your job, your brain tells you that if you're frustrated, you are wasting time. But the science says that struggle is the exact mechanism of deep learning.
It's like lifting weights. If the weight feels completely effortless, you aren't actually building muscle. You're just pantomiming. And that slow, interleaved, struggling learning process creates what we call flexible knowledge. You aren't just memorizing a procedure, you're building an abstract model that you can apply to new, unseen problems in a wicked world.
Right.
And the absolute peak of flexible knowledge, the ultimate weapon of the generalist, is the ability to step outside of your own direct experience entirely and use analogies.
Which leads us perfectly into the power of analogy. Let's go back in time again, to the turn of the 17th century. Johannes Kepler is staring at the sky, trying to figure out planetary motion. He's trying to explain how the planets move around the sun in elliptical orbits. But here's the catch. He has no hard data. Gravity hasn't been discovered yet.
Sir Isaac Newton won't publish his laws of universal gravitation for another 80 years.
Exactly. So how does Kepler solve a physics problem that no human has ever solved, using forces he cannot see or measure?
He uses wild, relentless analogies. He doesn't just stay within the rigid confines of 17th century astronomy.
Yes. He compared the invisible moving force of the sun to light spreading out. Then he compared it to heat, then to odor. When those didn't quite explain the elliptical orbits, he reached entirely outside his domain. He used analogies of river currents carrying debris. He thought about boatmen steering oars in water. He imagined brooms sweeping dust, balanced scales, and finally, magnets.
Magnets.
He solved the universe by thinking about brooms and magnets.
This is a masterclass in what psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Dan Lovallo call the outside view. When faced with a highly uncertain, complex project, specialists have a very strong natural inclination to take the inside view.
What does the inside view look like in practice? Let's ground it.
The inside view means focusing narrowly on the specific, unique, surface-level details of the problem right in front of you. Say you're a supply chain expert and a global shipping crisis happens. Your inside view tells you to look at your warehouse data, your specific truck routes, the granular details of your specific company's past performance. You treat the problem as entirely unique.
But the outside view does the exact opposite.
Yes. The outside view asks you to aggressively ignore the unique surface details of your current problem and instead generate multiple, diverse analogies from entirely different domains that share deep structural similarities. You look at how blood flows through the human circulatory system or how data packets move through a decentralized server network to solve your trucking problem.
The movie revenue study proves the superiority of the outside view so beautifully. Researchers wanted to see who could better predict the box office revenue of upcoming Hollywood movies, so they pitted a sophisticated mathematical algorithm against normal, everyday moviegoers.
A classic machine versus human test.
Right, and the algorithm was given the ultimate inside view. It had access to granular, specialized data, like the exact production budget, the genre, the historical box office draw of the star actors, the release date.
A purely data-driven, highly specialized model.
Exactly. But the everyday moviegoers, they were given virtually no granular data. They were armed with only one specific tool, basic analogies. They were given a list of 40 older movies and asked to rate how conceptually analogous the new movie was to the old ones. Based purely on those analogies, they made a revenue prediction.
And the result? The moviegoers, using a reference class of analogies, vastly outperformed the highly specialized mathematical model. The outside view beat the inside view.
Which is incredible.
But there is a crucial caveat to this study that we must highlight. If the moviegoers only relied on the single best analogy they could find, their predictive power collapsed. They became terribly inaccurate. The magic, the predictive power, only emerged when they used a full pool of diverse competing analogies.
This applies directly to corporate innovation, too. Kevin Dunbar is a researcher who spent a year deeply embedded in elite molecular biology labs, just watching how breakthroughs actually happen in real time.
Yeah.
The labs that were filled with homogeneous experts, say, a lab entirely full of E. coli specialists who had spent 20 years doing the exact same thing, struggled immensely.
Because they took the inside view.
Right. When they hit an unexpected experimental result or a failure, they just brute-forced endless, minor variations of the exact same experiment.
They suffered from what is known as cognitive entrenchment. They had mastered their specific tools so thoroughly that they became completely blind to alternative solutions.
But the labs that made the major world-changing breakthroughs were the diverse labs. They had chemists, physicists, evolutionary biologists, and even medical students sitting in the same room. When those labs got stuck on a complex protein structure, someone would throw out a completely unrelated analogy from fluid dynamics or thermodynamics, and they would solve the biology problem in a single afternoon meeting.
It is the power of cognitive diversity and analogical transfer.
So let's bring this down to earth. What does this mean for you, the listener, trying to navigate your career? Because if analogies in the outside view are this powerful, why do we actively punish them in corporate settings?
We definitely do.
If I am in a high-stakes boardroom trying to fix a modern logistics supply chain for a tech company, and I stand up and say, hey, let's look at how the Roman Empire managed grain shipments across the Mediterranean in 100 AD, I am going to get laughed right out of the room. My boss wants spreadsheets. They want granular data. They don't want a history lesson on Roman grain.
And that corporate demand for spreadsheets and granular data is exactly why established, dominant companies get violently disrupted by startups. They are cognitively entrenched. They demand the inside view because it feels rigorous, it feels professional, and it is easily quantifiable.
It looks good on paper.
Exactly. But in a wicked environment, that granular data is often incomplete, backward-looking, or totally misleading. Analogies are the cognitive circuit breakers that force you out of entrenched linear thinking.
Which brings us to the final and most personal part of our journey today. How do you actually build a career and a life using all of this information? We know we need to sample broadly. We know we need to embrace the desirable difficulties of slow learning. And we know we need to think in analogies. But how do you execute that when you have a mortgage to pay?
It starts with a concept economists call match quality. Match quality is simply the degree of fit between the work you are doing and who you inherently are, your natural abilities, your personality, your changing interests, and your values.
To understand the sheer economic and psychological power of match quality, we have to look at a brilliant natural experiment by an economist named Ofer Malamud. He studied the British higher education system a few decades ago, which accidentally set up the perfect test of the Tiger Path versus the Roger Path.
Oh, the English versus Scottish system?
Yes. At the time, if you lived in England or Wales, the education system forced you to specialize extremely early. You had to pick your specific narrow degree program before you even applied to college.
You had to make a lifelong commitment before you had any real experience.
Exactly. But if you lived just across the border in Scotland, the system was entirely different. The Scottish universities actually required you to sample broadly. You were forced to study multiple different fields for your first 2 years of college before you were allowed to declare a major and focus.
So the English students got a massive head start on their specific skills. The Scottish students fell behind academically in specific fields, but they gained something far more valuable: a massive amount of information about themselves.
And the life outcomes of these two groups are staggering. Malamud tracked them into their careers. The early specializing English students were statistically far more likely to switch careers entirely later in life.
Because they picked wrong.
Exactly. Because they had committed to a path before they knew who they were. And 10 years later, they realized they had terrible match quality. They ended up divorced from their careers, starting over from scratch.
But the late specializing Scottish students, because they were forced to sample, they found high match quality, they picked careers that actually fit them. And because of that fit, they caught up in income very quickly, surpassed the English students, and happily stayed in their chosen fields.
It's what researchers call a multi-armed bandit process. This analogy is so helpful. Imagine you walk into a casino, and you sit down in front of a row of 10 slot machines, the one-armed bandits. Each machine has a completely different payout probability, but you have no idea what those probabilities are. To maximize your winnings over the course of the night, you have to spend your initial time pulling a lot of different levers to figure out which machine works best. You have to sample.
If you just walk in, pick the very first machine you see, and pull that lever 10,000 times because you want a head start, you're almost certainly leaving money on the table. You might be pulling the worst lever in the casino. Career matching is the exact same mathematical problem. You have to sample different jobs, different roles, different hobbies to get the data signal about where you fit.
This data validates so many incredible, winding historical lives. We think late bloomers are rare, but they are often the most impactful people. Look at Vincent van Gogh. He didn't just emerge from the womb painting the Starry Night.
No, he was terrible for a long time.
He was an art dealer, then he was a teacher, then he worked in a bookstore, then he became a zealous religious evangelist wandering the coal mines. He failed at almost all of it. He didn't seriously touch a canvas until he was nearly 30. He was relentlessly pulling levers on the multi-armed bandit until he found his ultimate match quality.
Or look at Frances Hesselbein. She's a legend in the nonprofit world, but she didn't even start her professional career until her mid-50s.
Mid-50s, wow.
She spent her life sampling, taking on local volunteer roles, learning how to manage people in small community settings. Eventually, she ended up running the entire National Girl Scouts organization, completely transforming it, and receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She didn't have a head start. She had accumulated massive, diverse range.
This completely upends the popular narrative around grit. I feel like for the last decade, we have been constantly told that grit, passion, and perseverance for a single long-term goal is the ultimate moral virtue. If you quit, you're weak.
The concept of grit was popularized heavily by researcher Angela Duckworth, largely based on her studies of cadets enduring brutal basic training at the elite West Point Military Academy. She found that the grittiest cadets were the ones who didn't quit.
But if you look closely at the broader research, grit is highly contextual.
Yeah.
You aren't intrinsically a gritty person, nor are you intrinsically a lazy person.
Exactly. You just haven't found your context yet. A teenager might be totally unmotivated, bored, and lazy in a traditional math class, but then spend 10 hours a day meticulously building unimaginably complex architectural worlds in Minecraft. If you force someone to stick with a career goal that has incredibly poor match quality just for the sake of being gritty, you aren't building character. You are actively harming their potential.
I want to speak directly to you, the listener, right now. We are taught from a very young age that quitting is a moral failure. If you start playing the violin at age 10, you finish it. If you choose a college major at 18, you stick with it. If you take a corporate job, you grind it out. But quitting a path that offers poor match quality isn't failing. It is data collection.
That's a great way to put it.
It is you pulling a lever on the slot machine, realizing the payout is terrible for your specific personality, and having the courage to move to a better machine. Quitting is a vital strategic tool for generalists.
That adaptability, the willingness to drop a bad path, is what makes generalists so powerful in leadership and forecasting, too. Philip Tetlock is a political science researcher who ran massive multi-year forecasting tournaments. He wanted to see who was actually best at predicting global, geopolitical, and economic events.
And he divided the forecasters into two categories based on an old philosophical essay by Isaiah Berlin, the hedgehogs and the foxes.
Right. The hedgehogs were the narrow experts. They knew one big thing. They had a single, overarching, highly specialized framework for how the world worked. Maybe it was purely economic or purely environmental. And Tetlock found something shocking. The hedgehogs actually got worse at predicting the future as they gained more information.
Because they just bent the facts to fit their single worldview. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If a hedgehog's model didn't predict a recession and a recession happened, they didn't change their model. They just said, well, the timing was slightly off, or it was an unpredictable fluke.
But the winners of the forecasting tournaments were the foxes. The foxes were broad, omnivorous, curious generalists. They didn't have one grand theory. They had a toolbox full of different, sometimes contradictory micro-theories. They practiced active open-mindedness. They constantly adjusted their models based on new data. And most importantly, they didn't cling to a single tool.
And the danger of not being a fox, of refusing to drop your familiar tools when the environment changes, can literally be life and death. Let's look at the tragic story of the wildland smoke jumpers at the Man Gulch fire in 1949.
Oh, this is such a powerful example.
It really is. It was immortalized in Norman MacLean's book, Young Men in Fire. These elite firefighters parachuted into a valley, but the fire suddenly blew up and raced up the steep hill right at them. The foreman, Wagner Dodge, realized they couldn't outrun it. So he did something incredibly innovative. He stopped, took out a match, and lit the grass in front of him on fire.
He created an escape fire.
Yes, he burned away the fuel so he could step into the ashes and let the main fire wash over him. It was a brilliant, impromptu, outside-the-box solution to a wicked problem. He yelled at his men to drop their heavy axes and shovels and join him in the ashes. But the men had been so deeply trained that a firefighter's identity is tied to their tools. They couldn't drop them.
They just couldn't let go.
They literally ran up a steep mountain, clutching heavy steel tools, trying to outrun a wall of flame. Almost all of them died. They couldn't drop their heavy tools.
We saw the exact same psychological tragedy at NASA with the Challenger space shuttle disaster. The engineers had deep qualitative concerns about the O-rings freezing in cold weather, but NASA's highly specialized bureaucratic culture demanded quantitative data. In God we trust, all others bring data. Because the engineers couldn't provide hard numbers in an unprecedented, wicked situation, the management refused to drop their standard tool data-driven reasoning.
They ignored the qualitative warnings.
They ignored them, and the shuttle launched to disastrous results. Foxes survive because they know when to drop their heavy tools. They are intellectually light on their feet. They aren't anchored to a single identity or a single way of solving a problem.
So let's bring this all together. The modern world we live in is wicked. It is Martian tennis. The rules change, the feedback is murky, and the challenges we face tomorrow will not look like the challenges we faced yesterday. To survive and thrive in this environment, you need to be a fox. You need to sample broadly and pull multiple levers on the slot machine to figure out your match quality. You need to embrace the uncomfortable struggle of desirable difficulties so your knowledge becomes flexible. And when you inevitably get stuck, you need to look far outside your domain for structural analogies.
I want to leave you with one final concept that encapsulates this entire philosophy. It's the idea of the deliberate amateur. Andre Geim is a physicist who won a Nobel Prize for discovering graphene, a revolutionary supermaterial.
And how did he discover it? Not by grinding through standard linear research.
Nope. He discovered it by using a piece of ordinary Scotch tape on a lump of graphite on a Friday night in his lab. He intentionally set aside 10% of his lab time for what he called Friday night experiments. Just messing around, being playful, acting like an amateur entirely outside of his specific discipline. He once levitated a live frog using magnets just to see if he could. He said he didn't want to do research looking for things we already know are there. He wanted to do search.
That is beautiful.
Yeah.
He fiercely protected his dabble time. He protected his inner amateur. And that is exactly what you should do. We've established today that range, breadth, and a meandering, winding path are not signs of weakness. They are the ultimate competitive advantages in a complex, wicked world.
Absolutely.
But I want to leave you with a final, unmentioned puzzle to mull over. We know that being a generalist with flexible knowledge is how you triumph. But here is the paradox for you to explore on your own. We live in an economy where the hiring gates are increasingly guarded by artificial intelligence algorithms, applicant tracking systems that ruthlessly filter resumes for extreme, narrow keyword specialization.
The robots at the door.
Exactly. So how do you build a resume that reflects your broad, wicked world value when the robots at the door only speak the rigid language of a kind, specialized one?
That is the defining challenge for the modern generalist.
Something for you to chew on as you go about your week. Until next time, ignore the blue line on the GPS. Keep meandering, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.